Beast Beneath the Surface, the 1916 Jersey Shore Shark Attacks. Written by Stephen J. Pickering, read by Robert Bell Jones. This is a listen and live audio production.
Chapter 1. Prologue. The Heat Wave and the Shore. The summer of 1916 had come on like a furnace. June had been blistering, the kind of month that drove city dwellers out of their brick apartments in Philadelphia and New York, down toward the promise of breezes off the Atlantic. Newspapers reported record-breaking heat, horses collapsing in the streets, children fainting on tenement stoops. At night, families dragged mattresses onto rooftops, desperate for air. And so, they flocked eastward, to the sand, to the surf, to the small towns of New Jersey strung like beads along the coast. Trains brought them in thick, sweat-dampened crowds, men in stiff collars, women in ankle-length dresses, children shrieking with excitement. Hotel verandas overflowed with chatter and ice clinking in glasses. Beach umbrellas sprang up like bright mushrooms along the shoreline. The shore towns, Beach Haven, Spring Lake, Asbury Park, Matawan, swelled with life. The ocean was the great relief, cool, vast, and, so people thought, safe. To slip into its waters after days of choking city air was to feel reborn. The salt burned away the grime of coal smoke, the heat, the stress. Bathing suits of wool clung to bodies, and women waded in up to their knees, laughing nervously at the waves. Young men swam boldly out past the ropes, slicing through the water with broad strokes. But beneath the glittering surface, the sea held its own secrets. No one on the beach that summer knew how warm the waters had become, warmer than usual, drawing creatures closer to shore. No one noticed the flicker of shadows beneath the breakers, or the dark finned silhouette that had begun to prowl the coast. For centuries, Americans had believed sharks were not a danger in northern waters. Attacks, if they occurred at all, were tales from distant oceans, the stuff of sailors' yarns. Scientists assured the public the great fish of the sea were harmless here. So people laughed when a fisherman here or there claimed he'd seen something strange offshore. They scoffed at rumors. A shark? In New Jersey? Absurd. The ocean was for swimming, not for fear. The newspapers carried larger concerns anyway. Europe was at war, and America debated whether to join. President Wilson urged neutrality. At home, polio crept through cities, a silent threat, but at the shore, the troubles of the world seemed far away. Children ran free in the sand. Young couples courted under boardwalk lights. Bands played ragtime in grand hotels. And in the shallows, families bathed, their laughter ringing across the waves. It was July 1st, 1916, a Saturday. Holiday crowds filled the sands at Beach Haven, unaware that within hours the spell of innocence would shatter. The water they trusted would soon run red, and the name shark, once exotic, almost laughable, would become a word of terror whispered up and down the coast. Chapter 2. First Blood. Beach Haven, July 1st. The Angleside Hotel was the pride of Beach Haven. Its broad wooden verandas faced the Atlantic, where guests sat in wicker chairs, sipping iced tea and lemonade, watching the tide slide in. The sea breeze carried the mingled scents of cigar smoke, salt, and ladies' perfumes. That evening, a quartet tuned its strings in the dining room, and waiters in crisp jackets prepared for the supper rush. It was a holiday weekend, and every room was full. Children played tag on the sand, their laughter echoing above the waves. Men in rolled-up sleeves lounged on the porch, newspapers folded under their arms, while women in summer dresses strolled the boardwalk, parasols tilted against the fading sun. The war in Europe, the stifling heat of the cities, even the polio outbreak, all of it seemed far away. Among the guests was Charles Bruder von Somm, known to friends as a good-natured, athletic young man. At 25, he carried himself with the confidence of youth. his dark hair slicked neatly, his stride brisk. He had arrived that very afternoon from Philadelphia with his family, eager to escape the choking city heat. But as supper hour approached, Charles grew restless. The sight of the sea, vast, glittering bronze beneath the lowering sun, was too tempting. He pulled at the collar of his shirt, laughing. "I'll never last through dinner without a swim," he declared, grinning at his mother and father. "You'll forgive me if I go down for a dip?" His father chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll spoil your appetite, Charles." "Then I'll swim fast," Charles replied. He was already halfway across the sand, loosening the buttons of his jacket, a boyish eagerness in his step. The bathing pavilion was still lively, though the crowd was thinning. Families were packing up, mothers brushing sand from their children's hair, fathers tugging on shoes. A lifeguard tower stood at the edge of the beach, its white paint catching the last fire of the sunset. Charles emerged in a dark wool bathing suit, his bare chest pale against the deepening sky. A Chesapeake Bay retriever, a sandy-colored dog belonging to another guest, bounded after him, tail whipping happily. "Come on, boy," Charles called, racing into the surf. The dog barked and lunged, splashing at his heels. The water was cool, startling after the heat of the day. Charles dove forward, gasping with delight as the Atlantic closed over him. He surfaced, stroking outward toward deeper water, the dog paddling behind. For several minutes they played like this. Man and dog, leaping through waves, laughing, barking, the whole scene watched with amusement by those left on the sand. "He's like a child," one woman remarked, smiling at the spectacle. "Better hurry," another man said, nodding toward the hotel. "Dinner's being served." On the porch, waiters moved to and fro with trays of oysters, roast chicken, and champagne. The string quartet's first notes floated out across the twilight air. Then came the scream. It was sharp, unnatural, and cut through the murmur of conversation like a snapped wire. At first, some thought Charles was calling to the dog, or playing, but the tone of it, desperate, broken, froze every heart that heard it. The lifeguard, Alexander Ott, jerked upright in his chair. He shaded his eyes against the sinking sun and saw Van Sant thrashing, his arms flailing wildly. "Help!" The cry rang again, piercing. "Oh God, help me!" The dog was already swimming furiously toward shore, barking in panic. Around Van Sant, the water churned strangely. Dark swirls fanned out behind him. "Cramp!" a man shouted. "He's cramping!" But even as he said it, a thin red ribbon unfurled in the waves. A woman screamed. Ott leapt from his perch and ran, sand flying under his feet. A hotel bellhop, Sheridan Taylor, dropped the towels he was carrying and bolted after him. Together they plunged into the surf. "Hold on!" Ott bellowed. "We're coming!" Van Sant's face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He flailed toward them, but something yanked him backward, jerking his body in violent spasms. The red in the water thickened. "It's got me!" he shrieked, choking on salt water. "My legs! It's got my legs!" Ott seized him under the arms. Taylor grabbed his other side, but there was resistance. A pull from below, strong and horrifying. The water erupted around them as the creature surged, unseen except for a fleeting, dark shape that brushed against Ott's thigh. "God almighty!" Taylor gasped, pulling with all his strength. "It won't let him go." They heaved, dragging Van Sant's upper body toward shore, while his legs remained seized by the monster beneath. For one sickening moment, it seemed a tug-of-war between men and sea. Then, as abruptly as it had come, the creature released. The rescuers stumbled back, hauling Van Sant into shallow water. The sight silenced the crowd. Van Sant's left thigh was shredded, muscle and skin torn away to the bone. Blood poured from the wound, staining the sand with every pulse. His face twisted in agony, his lips already pale. "Quick!" Ott shouted. "Towels, anything! Press it, hard!" Several men rushed forward. Women fainted or turned their faces away. The dog whined and licked at Charles's hand, but was pushed back. Towels were pressed to the wound, hands shaking as the cloth turned sodden crimson in seconds. "Where's the doctor?" someone cried. "Fetch the doctor from the hotel." Runners sprinted up the beach. Inside the Ingleside diners paused, forks suspended midair, as words spread in frantic whispers. "A boy's been hurt, down on the beach. Hurry!" The hotel physician arrived, breathless, his black bag swinging. He knelt, examined the wound, and shook his head grimly. "There's nothing to be done," he murmured, though still he worked, binding, pressing, praying against hope. Charles's father pushed through the crowd, his face stricken. He knelt beside his son, clutching his hand. "Charles, stay with us. Do you hear me? Stay with us." But the young man's breathing grew ragged, his skin clammy. His eyes, glazed with shock, turned toward the horizon as if searching for the sun already vanished. Minutes later, his chest stilled. Silence fell heavy on the beach, broken only by the retreat of the tide. The ocean rolled on, indifferent, dark, swallowing the last crimson traces into its endless sweep. Back at the Ingleside, the string quartet played on, their melodies lilting over the verandas. Some guests, unaware, applauded the tune. Others sat in stunned quiet, staring out at the blackening sea. And for those who had seen it, the word whispered on their lips was the same, spoken with awe and dread. Shark. Chapter 3. The Doubt. Asbury Park, July 6th. The days after the Beach Haven tragedy were filled with uneasy whispers. At the Ingleside Hotel, some guests packed hastily, refusing to let their children near the surf. Others scoffed, dismissing the event as a freak accident. "A sea turtle," one man declared over cigars. "Or a big mackerel. Sharks don't attack people here. Preposterous." But the memory of the red water lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. Mothers clutched their children's hands more tightly. Lifeguards stared longer into the waves. The ocean no longer seemed quite so friendly. By the morning of July 6th, Asbury Park was brimming with holiday visitors. The 4th had just passed, and the boardwalk swayed with music and chatter. Vendors sold lemonade and saltwater taffy. Women in wide-brimmed hats strolled arm in arm. Brass bands played rags that spilled into the sea breeze. The beach itself was crowded, the sand dotted with striped bathing tents and sun umbrellas. Bathers waded into the water by the hundreds, splashing, laughing, tossing beach balls. Among the lifeguards was William Gallagher, a wiry young man perched high in his chair, scanning the surf. He had heard the rumors from Beach Haven, the boy killed by something in the sea. But he tried to push them aside. People were nervous enough already. Shortly after 2 p.m., a man named Charles Bruder, 33 years old and a bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel in nearby Spring Lake, decided on a swim. Tall and lean, Bruder was well known to guests for his quiet efficiency and easy smile. He slipped into his bathing costume, left his shoes by the dunes, and waded into the surf. The waves rolled in steady and calm. Bruder stroked out past the breakers with an even rhythm, his dark head bobbing between the whitecaps. Lifeguards watched approvingly. He was a strong swimmer, not one of the reckless boys who needed constant whistles. For 10 minutes, he cut through the water with grace. Then he vanished beneath a swell. When he reappeared, he was screaming. The cry rose above the boardwalk music, piercing, unmistakable. Gallagher sprang to his feet. "Boat! Get the boat out there! Now!" Other lifeguards scrambled to the surf, shoving a skiff into the breakers. People on the sand turned, hands shielding their eyes, staring in disbelief. Bruder thrashed wildly, his arms flailing. Blood spread around him in a crimson bloom. He screamed again, his voice breaking into gasps. "Oh God, it's taken my legs!" From the boat, the lifeguards rowed furiously. They reached him just as he began to sink and pulled him aboard. The sight that met them stole their breath. Both his legs were torn to ribbons, one nearly severed below the knee. The wounds were catastrophic, beyond anything they had ever imagined. Gallagher pressed his hands to the spurting stumps, but the blood welled fast, soaking the boards of the skiff. Bruder's face was ghastly pale, his lips flecked with foam. He murmured incoherently, shivering though the day was hot. "Hold on, Charlie. Hold on," Gallagher begged. But even as they rowed with all their might towards shore, they knew it was hopeless. By the time they dragged the boat onto the sand, Bruder had slipped into stillness. The crowd fell silent. Women covered their mouths. Children clung to their fathers' coats. The surf hissed indifferently at their feet. That evening, the New York Times newsroom buzzed with tension. Wire reports from New Jersey lay scattered across desks. "Second bather killed at the shore," one read. The editor frowned, tapping his pencil. "2 in less than a week," he muttered, "and they're calling it a shark this time." A reporter leaned in. "But are we sure? Scientists say sharks don't bite people. Could be a barracuda or—" "Barracuda? In New Jersey waters? Don't be daft." The editor slammed his hand on the desk. "Print it. Front page. The public has a right to know." A typesetter groaned, already rearranging the letters. Across the city, the words took shape. "Shark kills bather at Asbury Park. Second victim in week." At the American Museum of Natural History, ichthyologist Frederick Lucas shook his head at the newsboys hawking papers outside. "Nonsense," he told a colleague. "A shark may take a bite of a fish mistaken for food, but attacking a man? Impossible. They are not man-eaters in our waters." The colleague frowned. "And yet 2 are dead." Lucas adjusted his spectacles. "Coincidence. Panic makes people see what they wish to see. Mark my words, this is hysteria, not science." But on the Jersey coast, hysteria was becoming very real. That night, at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, guests gathered on the veranda, murmuring in low voices. The surf, once inviting, now seemed ominous in the moonlight. "They say his legs were torn off," whispered one woman. "Utter rot," her husband replied firmly. "No shark could do such a thing. It must have been a boat propeller." "And the boy in Beach Haven," she pressed. He shifted uncomfortably. "Accidents happen at sea." But when a child begged to swim the next morning, the woman gripped his hand tighter. "No," she said sharply. "Not today. Not tomorrow." And so the first seeds of dread took root. The summer idyll was cracking. The ocean, once trusted, now held a shadow. And somewhere beneath the rolling surf, the shadow moved again. Hunting. Chapter 4. The River Turns Red. Matawan Creek, July 12th. Matawan was a quiet town, nestled miles inland from the Atlantic. On a summer afternoon, its streets were slow and drowsy, shaded by elm trees, the air humming with cicadas. Shops lined Main Street, the butcher, the grocer, the barber, and beyond them stretched farms and woods. The creek cut a lazy path through it all, winding from the bay into town, its brackish waters lapping against grassy banks. Children had swum there for generations. It was shallow, calm, and safe. Parents could watch from the bank, knowing their boys were no more than a few yards from home. No one in Matawan worried about the sea. The sea was far away, a world apart. So on July 12th, as the noon sun beat down, a group of boys scampered to the creek's edge, stripping off shirts and shoes. Among them was Lester Stillwell, 11 years old, slight and pale, with a mischievous grin. He was known in town as a bit frail but spirited, a boy who longed to keep up with the older lads. "Come on, Lester, last one in's a chicken," one of the boys shouted. The water was cool, shaded by trees. The boys splashed and laughed, diving and dunking one another, their shouts carrying across the quiet town. Women hanging laundry paused to smile at the noise. A man mending a fence nearby nodded with approval. Boys being boys, nothing more. Then Lester shrieked. At first it sounded like play, but the sound grew sharp, raw. The others turned, startled. Lester flailed wildly, his face contorted. "Something's got me," he screamed. "Help! Please help!" The water around him exploded, a violent churn. Dark red spread in the current. The boys froze in horror. Then in a rush of terror, they scrambled for the bank, shouting, "Shark!" Shark in the creek. The cries rang through Matawan like fire bells. Men rushed from shops, wiping their hands on aprons. Women dropped baskets in the dust. "A shark? one man scoffed, running toward the creek. In fresh water? Impossible. But the boys' faces told another story. White with terror, eyes wide, voices breaking. It took him. It took Lester. Within minutes, dozens had gathered at the banks. The water rippled gently, almost mockingly calm now. No trace of Lester remained. Only a faint swirl of crimson eddied on the current. God Almighty, whispered the barber, hat in hand. One of the men pushed forward. Stanley Fisher, a young tailor, tall and broad-shouldered, known for his steady nature. He stood at the edge of the creek, jaw set, scanning the murky water. The boy's down there, he said grimly. We can't just stand here. Someone caught his arm. Stan, don't be a fool. If there's truly a shark. But Fisher shook him off. That's a child. I'll not let him lie down there while we gape like cowards. He stripped off his shirt and shoes and plunged into the creek. The water closed dark and cool around him. Fisher dove, groping through weeds and mud, his lungs burning as he searched. Above, townsfolk leaned over the banks, calling encouragement, their voices taut with fear. Minutes stretched. Then Fisher surfaced, gasping. I felt him, he cried. He's there. I'll bring him up. He dove again. This time he broke the surface, clutching Lester's limp body. The boy's skin was waxen, his small frame motionless. But Fisher's relief was cut short. A dark shape surged beneath him. The water erupted in a spray of foam. Fisher screamed as the shark struck, its jaws tearing into his thigh. Blood fanned out in an instant, mingling with Lester's. God, it's got him too, someone cried from shore. The crowd shouted in horror as Fisher thrashed, trying to keep hold of the boy. The shark lunged again, wrenching at him with terrifying force. Still he clung to Lester, refusing to let go. At last, hands reached down, seizing both bodies, dragging them up onto the bank. Fisher collapsed, blood pumping from a gaping wound in his thigh. His face was ashen, yet his voice was steady, if faint. Is the boy alive? He whispered. No one could answer. Lester lay still, beyond saving. As men bound Fisher's wound with belts and rags, he looked once more toward the water. Then let me die knowing I tried, he said softly. He was carried toward town, leaving a trail of blood behind. Word spread like wildfire. By mid-afternoon, Matawan was in uproar. Shops shuttered, women wept openly in doorways, and children were pulled indoors by frantic parents. A group of men armed themselves with rifles and shotguns, marching toward the creek. If a shark could swim here, in their own backyard, then no place was safe. They meant to kill it. On the banks, they fired round after round into the water, the shots cracking through the summer air. The creek churned with bullets, but no fin surfaced. The creature had vanished as silently as it had come. As if to prove it was still near, the shark struck again that very afternoon. Joseph Dunn, a 14-year-old boy, was swimming with friends further down the creek when the water erupted around him. It's got me, he cried, thrashing wildly. His friends seized his arms, pulling with desperate strength as the unseen jaws clamped tight on his leg. For a terrible instant, it seemed he would be dragged under. Then with a final wrench, they tore him free. Joseph was carried bleeding to safety, but alive. The only one to survive the Matawan assaults. By nightfall, Matawan was a place transformed. Streets once filled with the hum of summer evenings were silent. Lamps glowed behind curtained windows. The creek lay still beneath the stars, its banks deserted. In parlors and kitchens, families whispered in disbelief. A shark in the creek, a boy dead, a rescuer maimed and killed, another child nearly taken. The world had shifted. No longer could anyone say the ocean was safe or that sharks did not attack men. The truth had come crawling up their very creek, tearing through the heart of their town. And across the nation, newspapers thundered the news. Man-eating, shark strikes inland. Boy and rescuer dead. The panic that followed would sweep from New Jersey to Washington itself until even the president was forced to speak. But on that July night in the quiet town of Matawan, only grief reigned. Chapter 5. The Final Attack. Joseph Dunn's Survival and the Hunt for the Shark. At St. Peter's Hospital in New Brunswick, Joseph Dunn lay pale against white sheets, his leg bound in thick bandages. The doctors whispered among themselves, unsure if he could withstand the fever that would follow such wounds. Infection was the silent killer of the age, and the shark had left his flesh ragged and torn. His mother sat at his bedside, stroking his hair, tears shining in her eyes. "You're a brave boy, Joey. You fought it off. You're safe now." Joseph stirred, his voice weak but steady. "It wouldn't let go, Mama. It pulled so hard. But the boys, they saved me." His survival was hailed as a miracle. Newspapers seized upon it, printing headlines that shouted hope amid the terror. "Shark defeated, boy escapes with life." Yet Joseph's story was no comfort to the families of Lester Stillwell and Stanley Fisher, who mourned as Matawan draped itself in grief. Funerals drew crowds that overflowed church doors. The congregation hushed, their prayers heavy with dread. Fear now turned to action. The governor of New Jersey called for immediate measures. Rewards were offered for the capture or killing of the man-eater. Local fishermen, once content with their summer hauls, armed themselves with rifles, harpoons, and dynamite. The newspapers fueled the frenzy. Illustrations of monstrous sharks leapt from front pages, their jaws gaping wide. Cartoons showed terrified bathers fleeing the surf. Reporters painted lurid images of a beast haunting the coast, a sea wolf with a taste for human flesh. At taverns and on docks, men swore vengeance. "They've taken our boys," one fisherman growled, loading his rifle. "Now we'll take them." Armadas of small boats put out to sea, their occupants scanning the waves for fins. Some fired wildly at shadows. Others dropped baited hooks strung with slabs of meat. Still others hurled dynamite into the surf, the explosions booming across the bays. The Atlantic, which only weeks earlier had been a playground, was now a battlefield. Tourist towns felt the shock at once. Beaches that had been thronged were suddenly empty, striped tents flapping idly in the breeze. Boardwalk vendors complained of ruin, their taffy and lemonade going unsold. Hotel owners wrung their hands watching guests pack trunks and catch trains inland. "Better to roast in the city than risk the sea," one woman declared as she herded her children into a carriage. Lifeguards patrolled the sands in vain, their whistles silent. The horizon seemed haunted. Any ripple could be a fin. The panic climbed so high it reached the White House. President Woodrow Wilson, already burdened with the shadow of war in Europe, was briefed on the killings. Though skeptical of tales of sea monsters, he could not ignore the national frenzy. Funds were authorized for federal intervention. The Coast Guard was ordered to join the hunt, its cutters scanning the New Jersey coast with rifles at the ready. "The people must be reassured," Wilson said gravely. "This menace must be ended." On July 14th, the hunt reached its climax. At Raritan Bay, a group of fishermen set their nets. Among them was Michael Schleicher, a taxidermist and showman. As they hauled the lines, a great thrashing erupted in the shallows. The water boiled with fury as a massive shark entangled itself in the net. "Hold fast!" Schleicher shouted, gripping an oar. The beast snapped and lunged, nearly capsizing the boat. In desperation, Schleicher raised a broken oar and battered the creature's skull. Gunshots rang out. At last, after a savage struggle, the shark lay still. It was hauled ashore to great fanfare, a great white shark weighing over 300 pounds. When its belly was cut open, the remains of human flesh and bone were reportedly found within. The headlines blared across the country. "Man-eater slain, coast at last safe." Crowds gathered to gape at the carcass, its jaws propped open for photographers, its dead eyes glassy and unblinking. To many it was the very monster that had haunted the Jersey coast, now slain like a dragon of old. In Matawan, the news brought little comfort. Lester Stillwell was gone. Stanley Fisher, the tailor who had risked everything, was buried a hero. Mothers still kept their children far from the creek's edge. Yet slowly, people crept back to the shore. By August, the beaches began to fill once more. Fear dulled into memory, and memory dulled into myth. But in the quiet hours, those who had seen the attacks could not forget. The ocean's surface might glitter with sunlight, but beneath it, something darker always lurked. The summer of 1916 had taught a terrible truth. The sea was not ours. It never had been. Chapter 6. Epilogue, Fear and Legacy. By late August 1916, the beaches of New Jersey began to refill. Children squealed once more in the surf, men floated lazily on the breakers, and women waded in with careful smiles. Yet something had changed. For many, the joy of the ocean was tinged with unease. Parents watched more closely. Lifeguards stared longer into the swells. The Ingleside Hotel at Beach Haven still hosted its evening dances, but older guests whispered to one another about the Vanson boy. In Spring Lake, townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of Charles Bruder, the bell captain whose legs had been torn away. And in Matawan, the grief lingered deepest. Flowers lay on Lester Stillwell's grave well into autumn. Stanley Fisher's name was spoken with reverence, his sacrifice told and retold as an act of noble courage. The shark, or sharks, had been slain, but the fear they left behind did not vanish so easily. In the months that followed, debate raged. At the American Museum of Natural History, ichthyologists who had once declared sharks harmless found themselves besieged by reporters. Was it truly a man-eater? Journalists demanded. Yes, some admitted at last. A great white shark is capable of such attacks. Others still resisted. One rogue fish, they insisted. A freak event, not to be repeated. But the public was not convinced. Ordinary Americans had seen too much blood spilled. The image of a great beast haunting the Jersey coast had taken root in the national imagination. The newspapers, for their part, had fanned the flames. Bold headlines, grotesque illustrations, and breathless accounts had sold countless copies. They dubbed the creature the Jersey Man-Eater and likened it to a wolf of the sea. Editorials thundered that the ocean itself had turned hostile. Sermons warned of the dangers of arrogance in the face of nature. Even politicians spoke of it, promising safety to seaside towns. For weeks, the shark eclipsed even war in Europe as a subject of conversation. And though the frenzy waned with autumn, the memory of those headlines lingered. Before 1916, Americans had seen the ocean as playground, bountiful and benign. Sharks were little more than curiosities in aquariums or exotic tales from foreign waters. After 1916, everything was different. The sea had shown its teeth. Bathing culture, which had blossomed in the early 20th century, was suddenly shadowed by suspicion. Lifeguards drilled new vigilance. Fishermen spoke more often of dangerous fins. Parents warned their children. The idea of the man-eating shark was now part of American consciousness, a phrase that conjured dread. The decades rolled on, but the story was never forgotten. In the 1960s, journalists revisited it as part of seaside lore. In the 1970s, novelist Peter Benchley stumbled across accounts of the attacks while researching. Out of those bloody weeks in New Jersey came the seed of his book Jaws, a tale of a great white terrorizing a coastal town. When Jaws reached theaters in 1975, it reignited the same primal fear that had gripped America in 1916. Audiences gasped at the giant shark rising from the depths, at the helpless swimmers caught in its jaws. Beach attendance dropped across the country that summer, echoing the panic of 60 years before. Few realized that the fictional monster had a real ancestor, one that had once prowled the very waters of New Jersey. Even today, the truth remains clouded. Some argue that it was indeed a rogue great white that swam unnaturally close to shore, striking in a frenzy. Others believe more than one shark was involved, perhaps even a bull shark capable of surviving in fresh water, explaining the horror at Matawan Creek. Science has never reached full agreement, but the people of 1916 did not need consensus. They had seen the blood. They had buried their dead. As autumn came, the leaves along Matawan Creek turned gold and drifted into the water, covering the place where Lester Stillwell had vanished. The townspeople tried to return to normal life. Children walked to school past the quiet banks. Men went back to their trades. Yet every time the wind rustled the reeds or the water rippled strangely, the memory returned. For in Matawan, and in Beach Haven, and in Spring Lake, the summer of 1916 would never truly fade. The ocean had shown its hunger, and the people who witnessed it would never look at the water the same way again. The Jersey Shore shark attacks of 1916 were over, but their shadows stretched on, a reminder that the sea is not ours to tame.
Beast Beneath the Surface, the 1916 Jersey Shore Shark Attacks. Written by Stephen J. Pickering, read by Robert Bell Jones. This is a Listen and Live audio production.